He killed a child and his girlfriend, a crime so brutal that it seemed to defy comprehension, silencing a brave woman who was about to expose a monstrous secret. The murders were just the final act in a long and calculated campaign of abuse, orchestrated by a predator who used his position of trust to systematically destroy lives while his family looked the other way. The entire investigation would come to a head in a dramatic courtroom showdown where a judge would eventually call it the worst case I've ever seen, all because of a single piece of forensic evidence from a past crime that would finally bring a hidden monster to justice. The silence of the house was the first thing that spoke of the horror within, a quiet so profound it felt heavier than any scream. It was a silence that held the final terrified moments of a mother and child, their lives extinguished not in a burst of chaotic rage, but with the cold, methodical precision of a predator ensuring a witness could never speak. This was not just a double murder, it was the final brutal act of silencing a hero who had found the courage to stand up to an evil that had been allowed to fester for far too long. The tropical paradise of Honolulu, Hawaii, a place of breathtaking beauty where the scent of hibiscus hangs heavy in the air, was about to become the backdrop for a story so dark it would test the community's very understanding of human nature. In a city defined by the spirit of Aloha, the murders of Grace Robinson and her 7-year-old son Noah felt like a deep and personal violation, a stain on the island's soul that the pristine blue waters of the Pacific could never wash away. Grace was a beloved pediatric nurse at Queens Medical Center, a woman whose entire life was dedicated to healing and protecting the vulnerable, which made the circumstances of her death all the more tragic. She was known for her gentle demeanor and her unwavering moral compass, qualities that had recently led her to uncover a horrifying secret about her own boyfriend, a man she had once believed was her soulmate. The beautiful scenery of Hawaii, which usually served as a symbol of life and tranquility, now seemed to mock the ugliness of the truth that lay hidden in a quiet suburban home. Jamal Williams was a man who had built a life on a foundation of charm and deception, a community coach and youth mentor who used his public persona as the perfect camouflage for the monster that lurked beneath. He was seen as a pillar of the community, a role model for disadvantaged kids, a position of trust he had expertly weaponized to gain access to victims and to ensure the silence of those who might suspect him. Grace, in her love for him, had initially been his greatest advocate, blinded by the charismatic mask he showed the world. But she was too intelligent and too perceptive to be fooled forever, and when she finally saw the predator behind the smile, she had sealed her own fate and that of her innocent child. The crime scene in their small, well-kept home in the Manoa neighborhood was a portrait of calculated evil, a place where the mundane reality of family life had been violently interrupted. A half-finished puzzle of a volcano was spread across the living room floor, a testament to a child's last moments of play, now frozen in time. Investigators found no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a robbery gone wrong. This was the work of someone who had been welcomed into the home, someone who knew its layout and its occupants intimately. It was clear to the seasoned detectives of the Honolulu Police Department that this was not a random act of violence, but a systematic and deeply personal execution, designed to solve a problem that only the killer knew existed. The initial 911 call was made by Jamal himself, a masterful performance of a distraught boyfriend who had just stumbled upon an unimaginable horror. His voice was a carefully calibrated mixture of shock, grief, and panic, a performance that was almost convincing. He told the dispatcher he had been out for an early morning run and had come home to a scene of utter devastation, a story designed to place him as far from the crime as possible. It was the first of many lies he would tell, the opening act in a grand drama where he cast himself as the tragic survivor, the man who had lost everything in a single brutal moment. For the first responders who arrived at the scene, the contrast between the tranquil, sun-drenched beauty of the Hawaiian morning and the cold, silent darkness inside the house was a jarring and deeply unsettling experience. The air was still and heavy, carrying only the faint, sweet scent of a plumeria tree from the front yard, a scent that now seemed sickeningly out of place. They moved through the home with a grim and practiced professionalism, their faces masks of stone as they documented the evidence of a crime that was already beginning to feel like one of the most heinous in the island's history. This was not just a case, it was an assault on the very idea of paradise. As news of the double homicide began to spread, a wave of fear and disbelief washed over the tight-knit Honolulu community. In a place where the concept of ohana, or family, is so central to the culture, the murder of a mother and child felt like an attack on everyone. Friends and neighbors gathered outside the yellow police tape, their faces etched with shock and sorrow, struggling to comprehend how such a thing could happen in their peaceful neighborhood. They spoke of Grace's kindness, of Noah's infectious laughter, of a family that had seemed so happy and full of life, making the reality of their violent end all the more difficult to accept. Jamal played his part to perfection in those early hours, collapsing into the arms of a police officer, his body racked with what appeared to be uncontrollable sobs. He provided a detailed, if completely fabricated, account of his morning, weaving a narrative that was both plausible and designed to elicit maximum sympathy. He was already building his alibi, laying the groundwork for a defense that would paint him as another victim of the tragedy. But even in his performance of grief, there was a coldness, a subtle calculation that did not go unnoticed by the veteran detectives who were beginning to see the first cracks in his carefully constructed facade. The investigation would soon turn into a deep and disturbing dive into the life of Jamal Williams, peeling back the layers of his public persona to reveal the systemic abuse he had hidden for years. Grace's decision to confront him about a past crime she had uncovered was an act of immense bravery, a final, desperate attempt to protect another vulnerable person from the man she had once loved. She had become a hero, and in Jamal's twisted world, heroes were not to be celebrated, they were to be silenced. The paradise of Hawaii had become a hunting ground, and the monster was a man everyone had once called a friend. The full weight of the tragedy settled upon the city as the sun began to set over the Pacific, casting long, dark shadows across the island. The initial shock gave way to a simmering anger, a collective need for answers and for justice. The community was not just mourning the loss of two of its own, it was grappling with the terrifying knowledge that a predator had been living among them, a man who had used the trust and admiration of an entire community as a shield for his unspeakable crimes. The investigation into the deaths of Grace and Noah Robinson would not just be a search for a killer, it would be an unmasking of an evil that had hidden itself in the most unlikely of places, an evil that had turned a tropical paradise into the worst case the city had ever seen. The beautiful scenery of Honolulu, with its lush green mountains and crystal clear waters, would forever be tainted by the memory of this day, a permanent reminder that even in the brightest of places, the darkest of secrets can lie buried, waiting for a brave soul to bring them into the light. The silence in that small house in Manoa was a testament to Grace's courage, a final heartbreaking echo of a woman who had tried to do the right thing, even when she knew it could cost her everything. The arrest of Jamal Williams came just 72 hours after he made his tearful 911 call, a swift and decisive move by a Honolulu police department that had quickly seen through his performance of grief. Detectives arrived at the home of his parents, a sprawling, luxurious property in the Kahala neighborhood where Jamal had been staying, allegedly too traumatized to return to the scene of the crime. As he was led from the house in handcuffs, he maintained an air of calm, almost regal defiance, playing the part of a man wrongly accused, a victim of a tragic misunderstanding. But in the sterile, unforgiving light of the interrogation room, that facade would begin to crumble, not into a confession, but into a masterclass of psychological manipulation. Seated across from Detective Mark Johnson, Jamal did not appear to be a man who had just lost his entire world. He appeared to be a man who was mildly inconvenienced. He didn't deny his guilt, nor did he confess to it. He engaged in a sophisticated and infuriating campaign of gaslighting, designed to make the seasoned detective question his own perception of reality. Every question was met with a counter-question, every piece of evidence met with a subtle reframing that twisted the truth into a pretzel of semantic confusion. He was not just a suspect, he was a psychological predator, and this small windowless room was his new stage. "When you say at the scene, what do you really mean by that, detective?" Jamal would ask, his brow furrowed in a performance of deep, philosophical thought. Because scene is such a subjective word, isn't it? One person's crime scene is another person's home, a place of memories. This was his strategy, not to build a wall of lies, but to create a fog of confusion, to present himself as so obviously innocent that the very act of questioning him seemed absurd. He was attempting to manipulate the detectives into feeling foolish for even suspecting him, a tactic that was as audacious as it was infuriating for the investigators in the room. Detective Johnson, a man whose calm demeanor masked a razor-sharp intellect, had spent his career navigating the complex criminal underbelly that existed just beneath Honolulu's idyllic surface. He was immune to Jamal's charms and his intellectual games. He presented Jamal with evidence of his various lies, of his presence at the house when he claimed to be out running, and with each piece of information, Jamal would simply tilt his head, offering a plausible-sounding but utterly false explanation. He claimed he had come back from his run early, found the horrific scene, and panicked, his mind too clouded by grief to give an accurate timeline, a lie designed to excuse any and all inconsistencies in his story. His ability to lie was as natural as breathing, each falsehood delivered with a sincerity that would have convinced almost anyone else. He never raised his voice or showed any sign of anger. His control was absolute, a testament to a lifetime of practice. He spoke of Grace and Noah not as victims, but as abstract concepts, his emotional detachment so profound it was terrifying. There was no flicker of recognition, no hint of guilt in his eyes, just the calm, steady gaze of a predator who had successfully compartmentalized his kill and moved on. The absence of a soul was palpable in that room, a cold void that no amount of questioning could ever hope to fill. Jamal's attempts to gaslight the detective were relentless. "Are you sure you're feeling okay, detective? You seem a little on edge," he would say, his voice laced with a convincing blend of bewilderment and feigned concern. "Maybe the stress of this case is getting to you. It's a lot to handle, I understand." He was deconstructing their language, trying to dismantle the very foundation of their case brick by brick with psychological games, a tactic that revealed a profound contempt for their intelligence and the legal system they represented. He was a predator attempting to turn the interrogation into a maze of semantics and misdirection, a game he clearly believed he could win. The detectives watched as he masterfully twisted their words, making them feel as if they were the ones on trial. He spoke of his work as a youth mentor, painting himself as a savior of the community, a man who had dedicated his life to helping others. He was attempting to build a character so noble and selfless that the accusation of murder would seem not just unlikely, but impossible. This was his core defense, not an alibi, but a carefully constructed identity, a brand of goodness that he believed was impervious to the grubby reality of facts and evidence. For hours, this verbal chess match continued, with Jamal parrying every accusation and deflecting every piece of evidence with a carefully crafted narrative of victimhood and misunderstanding. He cried at one point, not with tears of remorse, but with tears of frustration, the manufactured sobs of a performer who was angry that his audience wasn't buying his act. It was a stunning performance of pathological narcissism, a complete inability to comprehend a world in which he was not the smartest person in the room, a world in which his actions had real, unavoidable consequences. The detectives knew they were not going to get a confession. Jamal Williams was far too arrogant and too in control for that. His game was to make them feel exhausted, to make them question the very evidence in front of them, to plant a seed of doubt that he hoped would grow into an acquittal. He spoke of his love for Grace and Noah with a poet's eloquence, his words beautiful and hollow, devoid of any genuine emotion. The interrogation of Jamal Williams yielded no confession, but it provided investigators with something just as valuable, a crystal-clear window into the mind of a sociopath. His attempts to gaslight seasoned detectives, to twist reality to fit his narrative, and his complete lack of empathy were a form of confession in themselves. As they led him to a holding cell, his smug confidence remained unshaken, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. He had given them nothing, he believed, and had successfully painted them as overzealous detectives chasing a phantom. He didn't know about the meticulous forensic work being done across the city, about the single microscopic piece of evidence that would render his entire performance meaningless. He was so confident in his ability to manipulate people that he had overlooked his inability to manipulate science. They weren't just dealing with a killer, they were dealing with a monster who genuinely believed he was untouchable, a monster who saw the law not as a force for justice, but as an intellectual puzzle he was uniquely qualified to solve. His arrogance, they knew, would be his ultimate undoing. While Jamal Williams played his psychological games in the interrogation room, the real work of building the case against him was unfolding across the island of Oahu. Prosecutor Emily Davis and her team began to peel back the layers of his life, and what they found was not just a killer, but a systemic predator who had built his entire existence on a foundation of lies, a man who used his position of trust to gain access to the most vulnerable, all while his family actively helped him maintain his pristine public image. The beautiful scenery of Honolulu, a place of sun and surf, was the perfect cover for a darkness that ran deeper than anyone could have imagined. The first major twist in the case came from the discovery of Jamal's family's complicity. Investigators uncovered a disturbing pattern of behavior stretching back years, where his parents had used their wealth and influence to make problems and people disappear. They were a powerful and well-connected family in Honolulu society, and they had a long history of protecting their son from the consequences of his actions. This wasn't the first time Jamal had been accused of violence, it was just the first time the victim hadn't been silenced or paid off. The family's network of enablers had created a monster by convincing him he was untouchable. Evidence emerged that Jamal's parents, a wealthy real estate developer and a prominent socialite, knew about their son's violent tendencies. Years earlier, another young woman who had been involved with Jamal had suddenly left the island after accusing him of a brutal assault, a case that had been quietly dropped after she received a substantial financial settlement from his family. They had bought her silence, allowing their son to continue his predatory behavior without fear of repercussion. They were not just parents in denial, they were active participants in his reign of terror, a vast network of enablers who had consistently chosen to look the other way. This discovery sent a shockwave through the affluent circles of Honolulu society. People who had known the Williams family for years, who had attended their lavish parties and donated to their charities, were forced to confront the horrifying reality that they had been socializing with a family that harbored a monster. They replayed conversations in their minds, searching for a sign, a flicker of the evil that lay beneath their polished surface, but found nothing. The Williams family's mask was flawless, their performance so convincing that it left no room for doubt, a chilling testament to their collective skill at deception. The prosecution's case grew stronger with each new lie they uncovered. They found evidence that Jamal's father had used his connections to intimidate potential witnesses and to plant false rumors about Grace's character, attempting to muddy the waters before the case even went to trial. He was trying to create a narrative that Grace was unstable, that she was the one with the dark secrets, a classic victim-blaming strategy designed to protect his monstrous son. The family was not just covering up a crime, they were actively trying to destroy the reputation of the woman their son had murdered. This pattern of calculated deception provided prosecutors with a powerful narrative for the jury. This was not a case of a good kid who made a single mistake. This was the story of a predator who had been cultivated and protected by a powerful family, a young man who had been taught from an early age that the rules did not apply to him. Grace's murder was the direct result of this upbringing, the act of a man who had never been forced to face consequences and who believed he had the right to eliminate anyone who threatened his perfect world. The investigation in Honolulu revealed the depth of the family's deception. They had told friends that Jamal was a brilliant student who had turned down scholarships to Ivy League schools to stay home and help his community, a complete fabrication designed to bolster his image as a local hero. They had created a fictional history for him, a world he controlled with absolute precision, funded by their immense wealth and protected by their network of powerful friends. The family had not just enabled a killer, they had manufactured one. The case was no longer about a single, tragic double murder. It was about a deeply rooted culture of corruption and impunity that had allowed a predator to flourish in a tropical paradise. Law enforcement agencies began to look into other unsolved cases, other sudden disappearances, other instances where the Williams family's name had been mentioned in passing. Jamal Williams, the man who believed he was a ghost, was finally taking shape, his shadowy past coming into sharp, horrifying focus, and with it, the shadowy network that had allowed him to operate for so long. Emily Davis now had a clear path forward. She would put not just Jamal on trial, but the entire system of wealth and privilege that had protected him. She would show the jury how a powerful family dynasty had used its influence to cover up crimes, creating a monster who believed he was above the law. The trial would not just be about the deaths of Grace and Noah Robinson, but about the unmasking of the Williams family, about forcing them to confront the truth of their own monstrous complicity in front of the entire world. The idyllic paradise of Honolulu was about to have its darkest secrets exposed, revealing that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who are raised in the most beautiful cages. In the months leading up to the trial, while Jamal Williams was held in custody, his family launched an aggressive and deeply cynical public relations campaign designed to salvage his reputation and poison the jury pool against the victim. They hired a high-powered crisis management firm from the mainland, a team of professional spin doctors who specialized in making monsters look like misunderstood saints. The family's vast wealth was now being weaponized, not to seek the truth, but to manufacture an alternate reality, one in which their son was the true victim and Grace Robinson was the architect of her own demise. The family's smear campaign began with a series of anonymous leaks to sympathetic bloggers and tabloid journalists. These carefully crafted stories painted Grace as a mentally unstable and manipulative woman who had a history of making false accusations. They fabricated a narrative in which she was a gold digger who had targeted Jamal for his family's wealth and who had become violent and erratic when he tried to end the relationship. It was a full-throated, deeply dishonest character assassination of the woman he had murdered, a despicable attempt to put the victim on trial from beyond the grave. They went after her character with a ruthless and systematic efficiency. They found a disgruntled former co-worker of Grace's and paid her to give a television interview where she described Grace as difficult and prone to exaggeration. They dug into her past, searching for any minor indiscretion they could twist and magnify into a fatal character flaw. This wasn't just a defense strategy, it was a scorched earth campaign designed to destroy the memory of a good woman, a final posthumous act of violence against the person their son had already killed. The campaign was profoundly insulting to the people of Honolulu, a community that valued respect and decency. The beautiful scenery of Hawaii, which had once been a source of pride, now felt like a cheap backdrop for a tawdry and disgusting media circus. The Williams family was treating the justice system like a hostile corporate takeover, believing that with enough money they could buy any narrative they wanted. Their actions revealed a contempt for the truth that was as profound as their son's contempt for human life. Prosecutor Emily Davis and her team watched in disbelief as the smear campaign unfolded, meticulously documenting every false story, every paid-for interview, every anonymous blog post. They knew that this pattern of conduct was a powerful piece of evidence in itself, a living demonstration of the defendant's family's character. She planned to argue that this campaign of lies was not an anomaly, but a continuation of their lifelong pattern of enabling and cover-ups, proof that they were incapable of genuine remorse and were more interested in protecting their name than in seeing justice done. For Grace's family, attending these pre-trial hearings was an exercise in pure torture. They were forced to sit just a few feet away from the man who had murdered their daughter and grandson and watch as his family systematically tried to destroy her good name. Her mother would often have to leave the courtroom, her body shaking with sobs of rage and grief. The family's complete lack of humanity was a fresh assault on their grief, a daily reminder that the people who had raised a monster were in their own way just as monstrous. Jamal, meanwhile, was an active participant in this strategy from behind bars. He coached his parents on what to say, which reporters to talk to, and which lies would be most effective. He saw his trial not as a legal proceeding, but as a marketing challenge, a branding opportunity. He was completely detached from the gravity of his situation, living in a world of his own making where he was the untouchable protagonist and everyone else was just a minor character in his story. His lack of remorse was not just an absence of guilt, it was an active, aggressive display of contempt for the victim, her family, and the entire judicial system. The most infuriating aspect of this pretrial conduct was its effect on the community. The constant barrage of negative stories about Grace began to have an effect, planting seeds of doubt in the minds of some. The Williams family was successfully polluting the very air of Honolulu, turning a clear-cut case of murder into a murky and debatable soap opera. They were not just fighting for their son's freedom, they were fighting to protect their own legacy, their own place in the city's elite, and they were willing to sacrifice the truth and the memory of a murdered woman to do it. The prosecution team knew they had to counter this narrative not with their own PR campaign, but with cold, hard facts in the courtroom. They would let the Williams family build their castle of lies in the media, and then they would systematically dismantle it brick by brick in front of the jury. The family's arrogance, like their sons, was a blinding force, preventing them from seeing the cliff they were happily skipping towards. They believed they could buy a verdict, and in doing so they were revealing their own moral bankruptcy to the world, a bankruptcy that would soon be exposed for all to see. The trial of Jamal Williams commenced under a blanket of humidity and media frenzy. The historic Alesis Yolani Hale Courthouse in downtown Honolulu transformed into the epicenter of a legal storm. The case had become a focal point for the city, a referendum on whether wealth and influence could still purchase a different brand of justice in a paradise that prided itself on community. As Jamal was led into the courtroom, he made a point of smiling and nodding at his family, a confident and theatrical gesture from a man who still believed he was in control of the narrative, a belief that was about to be shattered. Prosecutor Emily Davis began her opening statement not with an accusation, but with a tribute. She painted a vivid and heartbreaking picture of Grace Robinson and her son Noah, describing their kindness, their love for each other, and the bright futures that had been stolen from them. She wanted the jury to understand the profound void left by their absence before she introduced them to the man responsible for it. Through it all, Jamal remained unnervingly still, his face a mask of polite neutrality, a carefully rehearsed performance of a diligent defendant. The emotional turning point of the day came when the prosecution called its first witness, Grace's father, a man whose quiet dignity seemed to fill the entire courtroom. He spoke of his daughter's courage, of her growing fear of Jamal, and of the day he discovered the bodies. His testimony was a gut-wrenching account of a parent's worst nightmare, delivered with a strength that was both inspiring and almost unbearable to watch. Jurors dabbed at their eyes with tissues, and even the stern-faced judge, David Chen, seemed to be moved by his quiet testimony. And it was in this moment of raw, universal emotion that the Williams family chose to reveal the true extent of their monstrosity as Jamal's parents sat in the front row, their faces arranged in masks of somber concern. A bailiff noticed a small, almost imperceptible movement. Jamal's mother, a woman who had given countless interviews about her son's gentle nature, was subtly passing a note to a journalist seated behind her. The bailiff discreetly intercepted the note, a small, folded piece of paper that would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation. The note contained a list of talking points, a series of vicious and untrue rumors about Grace's past, designed to be leaked to the press during the lunch recess. It was a premeditated act of character assassination, an attempt to use the media to attack the victim while her own father was on the witness stand describing the horror of her death. When the note was handed to Judge Chen, a palpable wave of fury washed over his face. He immediately excused the jury and then ordered Jamal's parents to approach the bench, his voice a low and dangerous growl. The chaos that erupted was immediate. Judge Chen began berating the couple, his voice booming with a righteous anger rarely seen from the bench, calling their actions despicable and a disgrace to his court. He held them in contempt, ordering them to be removed from the courtroom for the remainder of the trial. As they were let out, Jamal's mother had the audacity to look shocked and offended, as if she were the one being victimized. It was a stunning display of the arrogance and entitlement that had created a killer. For the jury, who was later informed of the reason for the parents' removal, the damage was already done. They had witnessed an act of unimaginable cruelty, a family so committed to their lies that they would attempt to slander a murder victim during her own father's testimony. The family's exodus from the courtroom was not one of shame, but of forced removal, a powerful and symbolic moment that exposed their active role in the web of deceit. This was no longer just a trial about a murder, it was a trial about a corrupt system of enablers who had finally been held to account. The incident set the tone for the rest of the trial. The Williams family had shed their mask of civility and revealed the predators beneath, a family of manipulators who would stop at nothing to control the narrative. Their attempt to plant a story with the press was not a sign of them cracking under pressure, it was a tactical move, a display of power from people who believed they were in complete control. They had wanted to taint the jury pool, but in doing so, they had inadvertently signed their own son's conviction. When the trial resumed, the atmosphere had changed. The jury now looked at Jamal not with curiosity, but with a mixture of fear and disgust. They had seen the rotten roots from which he had grown, the family culture of lies and manipulation that had shaped him into a monster. The note-passing incident had been a profound miscalculation, a moment of hubris that would echo through the remainder of the proceedings, a constant reminder of the chilling depravity they were tasked with judging. The trial had truly begun, not with an opening statement, but with a single, folded piece of paper that had laid the family's black hearts bare for all to see. With the jury already recoiling from the Williams family's monstrous courtroom behavior, Prosecutor Emily Davis knew it was the perfect time to tighten the noose with science. The prosecution's case had been a methodical and damning presentation of financial records and witness testimony that systematically dismantled Jamal's web of lies. They had shown the jury the life of luxury he had been living off of Grace's stolen money and the fear she had expressed to friends in her final weeks. But the most devastating blow was yet to come, a mid-trial twist that would transform the case from a single murder trial into the unmasking of a serial predator. Davis called a surprise witness to the stand, a name that had not appeared on any of the pre-trial witness lists, a move that sent a ripple of anticipation through the courtroom. A woman named Keisha Taylor walked nervously to the witness box, her hands trembling as she was sworn in. She was a quiet, unassuming woman from a neighboring island, and as she began to speak, her voice barely a whisper, the entire courtroom leaned in, captivated by her story. Keisha was the previous victim, a ghost from a past crime who had returned to ensure justice was served for the woman who was not so lucky. Keisha testified that 5 years earlier she had been in a relationship with Jamal Williams, a relationship that had ended with a brutal, near-fatal assault. She described his disarming charm, his friendly chatter, and the way he had expertly manufactured an atmosphere of safety and trust before his charming facade melted away to reveal the vacuous evil beneath. She recounted the terrifying struggle, the feeling of his hands around her neck, and the cold, predatory emptiness in his eyes. It was only by a sheer miracle of adrenaline and desperation that she had managed to fight him off and escape with her life. She had reported the incident to the police, but the Williams family's influence had quickly and quietly made the case disappear. She was pressured, intimidated, and ultimately paid a large sum of money to sign a non-disclosure agreement and leave Hawaii forever. For 5 years, she had lived in fear, haunted by the memory of the handsome man with the dead eyes. It wasn't until she saw Jamal's face on a national news report about the Honolulu murder trial that she finally understood what had happened to her. She immediately contacted the Honolulu prosecutor's office, her story providing the final, crucial piece of the puzzle. Victoria Hughes had kept Keisha's existence a closely guarded secret, a tactical decision that now paid off spectacularly. The defense was caught completely off guard, with no time to prepare a cross-examination or attempt to discredit the witness. The defense attorney could only sit in stunned silence as Keisha Taylor's testimony unfolded, each word another nail in his client's coffin. He looked over at Jamal, expecting to see a look of panic or fear, but saw only a flicker of annoyance, the irritation of a predator whose past failure had come back to haunt him. The impact of her testimony was profound. It solidified the prosecution's narrative that Jamal Williams was not just a murderer, but a serial predator who had been honing his skills for years. It explained the lack of evidence at other potential crime scenes. He was a killer whose family had always cleaned up his mistakes. The attack on Keisha Taylor was the brutal practice run that had taught him he could get away with anything. The jury could now see the murder of Grace and Noah Robinson not as an isolated event, but as the culmination of a long and bloody apprenticeship in violence. But the most damning part of Keisha's testimony was yet to come. She told the court that during the assault, a distinctive gold chain she was wearing had been broken, a piece of jewelry her grandmother had given her. She had never seen it again. It was at that moment that Emily Davis presented the jury with a new piece of evidence, a photograph taken from Jamal's private social media account, a photo of him at a party just a month before Grace's murder. Around his neck, gleaming under the party lights, was the very same distinctive gold chain. He had kept a trophy from his first victim, a sickening memento of his power and control. For the jury, this was the moment that connected all the dots. It provided irrefutable proof of Jamal's methods, establishing a clear and undeniable pattern of predatory behavior. This wasn't a one-time incident or a tragic mistake. This was a signature crime, a rehearsed and perfected hunting technique. Keisha Taylor was living proof of Jamal's malevolence, and the gold chain was the physical evidence that linked his past to his present. The man who portrayed himself as a community hero was in fact a monster who collected souvenirs from his victims. When Keisha Taylor stepped down from the witness stand, the entire dynamic of the trial had shifted. The presumption of innocence, already hanging by a thread, was now completely obliterated. The jury was no longer just considering the evidence related to the Honolulu crime. They were now aware that they were in the presence of a predator, a man who had tried to kill before and had finally succeeded. The question in their minds was no longer whether he was guilty, but how many other victims his family's money had managed to bury over the years. Jamal's reaction to this devastating testimony was, as always, chillingly detached. He simply whispered to his lawyer that the woman was a liar, another gold digger seeking attention, another obstacle to be overcome. His belief in his own invincibility was so absolute that even the testimony of a surviving victim could not shake it. But for everyone else in that courtroom, the truth was now blindingly clear. They were looking at a serial predator, and the quiet, courageous testimony of Keisha Taylor had been the key that unlocked his cage. The defense case for Jamal Williams was in a state of freefall, crippled by the surprise testimony of a prior victim and the defendant's own family being ejected from the courtroom for jury tampering. His attorney, a high-priced lawyer hired by the Williams family, knew that his only hope was to create some form of chaos, to throw enough mud at the wall and hope that some of it stuck. His strategy was a long shot, a desperate attempt to pivot from a defense of innocence to a full-blown assault on the integrity of the investigation itself. That strategy, however, relied on a key witness they believed they could control. The defense decided to call a hostile witness, a disgruntled former colleague of Detective Mark Johnson, whom they hoped would testify that Johnson had a reputation for cutting corners and planting evidence to secure convictions. They had found this witness, a disgraced ex-cop who had been fired for misconduct, and paid him a substantial sum for his testimony. The plan was to paint Detective Johnson as a rogue cop obsessed with taking down a prominent family, a narrative that would, they hoped, cast doubt on the entire mountain of evidence he had gathered against Jamal. When the witness, a man named Frank Miller, took the stand, he initially played his part perfectly. He described Detective Johnson as a cowboy who was known for his aggressive tactics and his willingness to bend the rules. He planted the seeds of doubt the defense was hoping for, suggesting that a cop like Johnson would have no problem manufacturing evidence to fit his theory of the crime. Jamal watched from the defense table with a confident smirk, clearly enjoying the public takedown of the man who had dared to challenge him. But the defense's strategy began to unravel the moment prosecutor Emily Davis stood up for cross-examination. Davis had anticipated this move, and her team had spent weeks digging into Frank Miller's past. She began not by defending Detective Johnson, but by calmly walking Miller through the details of his own termination from the Honolulu Police Department. She revealed that he had not been fired for a minor infraction, but for a pattern of perjury and evidence tampering in a major drug case, a crime for which he had narrowly avoided prosecution himself. Miller's confident demeanor began to crack as Davis tightened the net. She presented the jury with his own internal affairs file, a thick document detailing a history of lies, corruption, and abuse of power. The paid-for character assassin was being exposed as a fraud himself, his credibility evaporating under the harsh lights of the courtroom. The jury, which had been listening intently, now looked at Miller with open contempt. The hostile witness the defense had hoped would be their savior was turning into another liability. The turning point came when Davis shifted her questioning to Miller's relationship with the Williams family. She presented phone records showing dozens of calls between Miller and Jamal's father in the weeks leading up to the trial. She then presented bank records showing a series of large, unexplained cash deposits into Miller's bank account, deposits that coincided perfectly with the dates of those phone calls. The defense's star witness had not just been discredited, he had been exposed as a hired gun, a perjurer who was being paid by the defendant's family to lie under oath. Frank Miller, cornered and exposed, completely fell apart on the stand. He began to stammer, his story changing with each question, his lies becoming more transparent and pathetic. The defense attorney repeatedly objected, but the damage was done. His attempt to create a smokescreen had backfired spectacularly, and the fire was now consuming his own case. He had not just failed to discredit the lead detective, he had inadvertently proven the prosecution's central theme that the Williams family would stop at nothing, including committing new felonies in open court, to protect their monstrous son. The judge, his face a mask of cold fury, was forced to stop the testimony. He excused the jury and then informed Frank Miller that he was under investigation for perjury, a crime that could send him to prison for a very long time. The hostile witness, who had walked into the courtroom as a confident accuser, was now a trembling, broken man, his own life in ruins. The defense's desperate gambit had not just failed, it had imploded, adding another layer of criminality to a case already overflowing with it. Jamal Williams watched this entire spectacle, not with fear but with a look of profound disgust. He was not angry at his family for getting caught, he was angry at them for being so clumsy. In his mind, their failure was a reflection on him, a stain on his own brand of intellectual superiority. He shot a look of pure venom at his father's lawyer, a look that conveyed a promise of violence. For everyone else in that courtroom, the scene was a final, damning confirmation of the deep-seated corruption that had allowed a predator like Jamal to flourish for so long. The trial would continue, but the verdict was now a foregone conclusion. With the defense's case utterly annihilated by their own catastrophic attempt to introduce a perjured witness, the trial moved into its final and most emotionally devastating phase, the victim impact statements. The legal arguments were over, the evidence had been presented, and all that remained was for the human cost of Jamal Williams's actions to be laid bare before the court. The atmosphere in the Honolulu courtroom was thick with a grief that was almost unbearable, a collective mourning for a mother and child whose lives had been so brutally and senselessly stolen. Grace's sister was the first to speak, her voice trembling but clear as she read a letter she had written to her nephew, Noah. She spoke of his love for superheroes, his infectious giggle, and the way he would scrunch up his nose when he was about to tell a joke. She described a little boy who was full of a light and a joy that had been a gift to everyone who knew him. Her words painted a portrait of a childhood that would never be, a future of scraped knees, first loves, and graduations that now existed only in the realm of heartbreaking what-ifs. As she spoke, a young woman on the jury, a mother herself, began to weep. She tried to stifle her sobs, pressing a tissue to her eyes, but the emotion was too powerful. Her quiet, desperate tears were a mirror of the collective heartbreak in the room, a raw and human reaction to a loss so profound it transcended the formal confines of a legal proceeding. The judge, seeing her distress, called for a brief recess, a moment of compassion in a case that had been defined by its utter lack of it. The break did little to quell the emotional tidal wave that was building in the courtroom. When the proceedings resumed, it was Grace's mother who approached the podium. She did not speak of her daughter's life, but of the ripple effects of her death. She spoke of the empty seat at the dinner table, the silence in a house that was once filled with laughter, and the gut-wrenching pain of packing away her 7-year-old grandson's toys. Her statement was a powerful and devastating testament to the unending grief that is the true legacy of a murderer's actions. Through it all, Jamal Williams sat impassively, his face a blank canvas. He showed no emotion, no flicker of remorse, only the same cold, reptilian stillness he had maintained throughout the trial. His emotional detachment was a wall, a fortress of narcissism that no amount of human pain could seem to penetrate. He was an observer at his own trial, a spectator to the devastation he had caused, completely disconnected from the reality of his own monstrousness. The breaking point came with the final victim impact statement delivered by the father of the other young woman Jamal had attacked years before. He did not speak of his daughter's survival, but of the life that Jamal had stolen from her even though he had failed to kill her. He described a vibrant, confident young woman who was now a ghost, haunted by PTSD, terrified of her own shadow, her dreams and ambitions replaced by a daily struggle with fear and anxiety. His testimony was a chilling reminder that Jamal was not just a killer, but a soul destroyer, a predator whose violence left scars that would never heal. It was this final statement that seemed to finally break through the jury's composure. The young mother was not the only one crying now. Several jurors, men and women of all ages and backgrounds, were seen wiping away tears, their faces masks of cold, hard judgment as they stared at the defendant. They had been chosen to be impartial arbiters of fact, but they were also human beings, and the sheer overwhelming weight of the human suffering in that room had become an undeniable piece of evidence in itself. The cumulative effect of these statements was a powerful and irrefutable testament to the evil that sat at the defense table. The jury had heard not just the story of a crime, but the story of its aftermath, the unending and devastating human cost of one man's predatory ego. The tears in the jury box were a silent verdict, a human response to an inhuman act. The breaking point had been reached, not with a shout, but with the quiet, shared sorrow of a community that had been forced to look into the abyss and had seen a monster staring back. Just when it seemed the trial of Jamal Williams could not get any more horrifying, prosecutor Emily Davis revealed her final, most devastating secret. The prosecution had built an ironclad case linking Jamal to two separate attacks and exposing his family's corrupt attempts to obstruct justice. The jury was already convinced of his guilt, but Davis knew that to ensure he would be locked away forever, she needed to show them the true underlying reason for the murders of Grace and Noah Robinson, a motive so dark and twisted it would redefine the very nature of his evil. The final witness for the prosecution was a forensic accountant who had been given access to the finances of the youth sports charity that Jamal had founded and run, the very organization that had made him a beloved figure in the Honolulu community. The defense had repeatedly pointed to his work with the charity as proof of his good character, a narrative that was about to be spectacularly and permanently destroyed. The beautiful paradise of Hawaii, which had lauded Jamal as a local hero, was about to learn that its hero was a fraud of the highest order. The accountant walked the jury through a series of complex financial charts, but his conclusion was terrifyingly simple. For years, Jamal Williams had been using the charity as a personal piggy bank, embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars in donations that were meant to help disadvantaged children. He had been funding his lavish lifestyle, the expensive cars, the designer clothes, the exclusive parties, with money stolen from the very community he pretended to serve. It was a web of financial fraud, so deep and so brazen it was almost unbelievable. But the fraud was not the twist. The final revelation came when the accountant detailed a specific pattern of withdrawals. He had found dozens of large, regular payments made to a series of shell corporations that were in turn controlled by a shadowy figure on the mainland. These were not payments for sports equipment or travel expenses. They were hush money payments. Jamal wasn't just stealing from the charity. He was using its funds to cover up an even more monstrous crime, a crime that Grace Robinson had tragically discovered just days before she was killed. The truth was that Jamal had been using his position as a youth coach to abuse his players systemically. He was a powerful predator who had been using his position of trust to prey on vulnerable children for years, and the charity was his hunting ground. The money he was embezzling was being used to pay off the families of his victims, buying their silence and allowing his reign of terror to continue unchecked. His entire public persona, his entire life, was a carefully constructed facade to enable his darkest appetites. The courtroom was plunged into a stunned, horrified silence. This was the secret Grace had uncovered. She had been preparing to go to the police, to expose not just the financial fraud, but the years of hidden abuse that it was designed to conceal. Jamal had not killed her to protect his lifestyle. He had killed her to protect his access to his victims. The murders of Grace and her son were not just acts of greed, they were the desperate, calculated actions of a serial child predator trying to silence the one person brave enough to stop him. This final revelation recontextualized everything the jury had heard. Jamal's gaslighting in the interrogation room, his family's smear campaign, his contemptuous behavior in court, it was all part of the same monstrous pattern of a predator who believed he had the right to do whatever he wanted to whomever he wanted. The man who had been celebrated as a mentor and a hero was, in fact, a monster who preyed on the very children he was supposed to be protecting. It was the ultimate betrayal of trust, the ultimate act of hypocrisy. Jamal's reaction to this final, damning testimony was not one of rage or denial. As the accountant detailed the payments, a small, almost imperceptible smile played on Jamal's lips. He was not ashamed of what he had done. He seemed to be proud of the complexity of his scheme. In his twisted mind, the intricate web of shell corporations and hush money payments was a testament to his intellectual superiority, a grand design that he believed was too brilliant for anyone to ever unravel. He was a monster who admired his own monstrosity. For the jury, this was the final, unforgivable piece of the puzzle. They were not just looking at a murderer, they were looking at a predator of the worst possible kind, a man who had corrupted a charitable organization into his own personal hunting preserve. The beautiful island of Hawaii, which had placed its trust in him, had been betrayed in the most profound way imaginable. The case was no longer just about justice for Grace and Noah, it was about justice for all the unknown victims whose voices had been silenced by the Williams family's money and their son's unspeakable evil. The final revelation was complete, and the true nature of the monster had been laid bare for all to see. The jury's verdict was a formality, a swift and unanimous decision that was delivered with a grim and resolute finality. Jamal Williams was found guilty on all counts, his conviction a foregone conclusion after the horrifying final revelation of his systemic abuse. But the story was not over. The sentencing hearing, held weeks later, would provide the final shocking chapter in a case that had already pushed the boundaries of conceivable evil. It was here that the judge, a man who had presided over hundreds of trials, would declare it the worst case I've ever seen. The victim impact statements were a final heartbreaking tribute to the lives Jamal had destroyed. Grace's parents spoke of their unending grief, but they also spoke of their daughter's heroism, of the courage it took for her to stand up to a monster, even at the cost of her own life. Then, in a stunning and unexpected moment, the parents of several of Jamal's other victims, the ones who had been silenced by his family's money, took the stand. Empowered by the verdict, they broke their non-disclosure agreements, one by one, their voices shaking with a mixture of fear and righteous anger as they described the abuse their children had endured. It was a story defined by the bravery of numerous victims finally coming forward, a chorus of voices rising up to condemn the man who had stolen their children's innocence. Through it all, Jamal sat impassively, his face a blank canvas, his emotional detachment as profound as ever. He seemed to see these people not as human beings he had harmed, but as minor characters in his story, actors who were overplaying their parts. When it was time for the judge to deliver the sentence, he did not simply read from a prepared statement. He removed his glasses, leaned forward over the bench, and spoke directly to Jamal, his voice low and menacing, a departure from judicial protocol that stunned the courtroom into silence. He told him that in his 30 years on the bench, he had seen evil in many forms, but that Jamal represented something unique, a complete and total absence of humanity, a void of soul so absolute it was terrifying. It was at this point that he called it the worst case I've ever seen. He condemned him not just for his crimes, but for his character, for the sadistic pleasure he took in inflicting pain, for the arrogant contempt he had shown for the law, for human life, and for the grieving families in his courtroom. As the judge spoke, Jamal's calm facade finally began to crack, his face contorting with a rage he could no longer conceal. He had been the center of attention for months, and now this judge was reducing him to nothing more than a pathetic, soulless creature. His narcissism could not tolerate it. The judge was stealing his power, his control of the narrative, and he was not going to allow it. Just as Judge Chen was about to formally impose the sentence of multiple life terms without the possibility of parole, Jamal Williams snapped. He lunged forward against his restraints and screamed at the judge, his voice a venomous hiss. "You think this is over?" he shrieked, his eyes wild with a murderous fury. "I will get out, and when I do, I will find your family, I will find your children, and I will do to them what I did to all the others." The threat, so direct, so violent, so personal, hung in the air, a final shocking testament to the unrepentant evil that resided within him. But the final twist was yet to come. After Jamal was dragged from the courtroom, still screaming threats and profanities, Judge Chen turned his attention to Jamal's parents, who had been allowed back in for the sentencing. In a stunning move, he announced that, based on the evidence presented during the trial of their active and long-term conspiracy to cover up their son's crimes, he was instructing the district attorney's office to open a new investigation. He was charging both of them with obstruction of justice, witness tampering, and accessory to the crimes of their son. Justice was not just for the killer, but for the enablers. In that moment, the judge sent a powerful message that the network of enablers who had looked the other way, the people who had used their wealth and power to protect a monster, would be held accountable. A wave of applause erupted from the gallery, a spontaneous and cathartic release from a community that had seen justice served not just to a killer, but to the system that had created him. The beautiful paradise of Honolulu had been forced to confront an ugly truth, but in the end it had affirmed that no one, no matter how wealthy or powerful, is above the law. The final act of Jamal Williams was not one of remorse, but of pure, defiant evil. His threat to the judge was his final gift to the world, a chilling reminder that some monsters cannot be redeemed, they can only be caged. As the families left the courthouse, they did so with the grim satisfaction of knowing that the entire corrupt enterprise that had brought so much darkness into their lives would be dismantled, ensuring that the Williams family's legacy would be one of infamy and ruin.